Welcome to this webinar organized by the Child Protection Hub. My name is Evgenia Generalova and I'm Knowledge Manager for the Child Hub. At the Child Hub, we organize a lot of online and offline activities for us to exchange knowledge between each other and develop capacities, and this webinar is one of them. Before we proceed, I would like to ask you to let me know in the chat box below there if you can hear me well. Yes. Wonderful. Good. Thank you very much. So today we are going to talk about trafficking along migration routes to Europe and how we bridge the gap between migration, asylum, and anti-trafficking. And I will give the floor to Enrico Ragaglia, who is Senior Project Manager at the ICMPD in the Anti-Trafficking Program and who is based in Vienna. Before that, I would like you to take a few moments and answer a few questions about how your experience joining this webinar was and how you learned about that. You should be able to see the polls right now on your screen. There, it's a bit of a mirror for me. Yes, okay, I can see the polls. Just take a few seconds, please. Okay, I can see people voting. Okay, so it was easy for you to join. And how did you learn about the webinar? Is the last poll? Okay. Just one more second. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. So we are closing the polls now. In case it's the first time you're attending our webinar, I would like to inform you that if you want to ask any question or post a comment, please use the chat below that you already are familiar with. Unfortunately, you as a participant don't have the microphone, right? So you cannot talk to us, but please feel free to write questions, comments, answers, opinions, whatever, in the chat box below. Okay. Good. And also you now should be able to see a box there with the web links. There you will see links for the page with our webinars, about the links to the research paper that is going to be presented today, our newsletter, and some other useful links. So please take a minute to explore them. And now I think we are ready, and I'm giving the floor to Enrico. Enrico, please, the floor is yours.
Hello. Good afternoon to everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, welcome to everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining this webinar organized by our colleagues from Third Zone. My name is Enrico Ragaglia, and I am a project manager at the ICMPD headquarters in Vienna, where I've been working for some years. I may know some of you. I saw in the list that there are some old colleagues and friends. Before starting with the two presentations that you can see on the main screen, I would just like to provide you with a brief introduction to this webinar, to the study, and to the presenters themselves. I will then hopefully be able to moderate a question and answer session after the presentations. I've had some issues with the connection, but now things very stable. So to start with, putting the webinar into the context, as you may have already read from the webinar webpage, and as you are most probably all aware of, we are talking here about the years 2015 and 2016, where we saw an unprecedented increase in the numbers of people traveling by sea, but also overland along migration routes to the EU, with a total of almost 1.5 million people irregularly entering EU countries. Trafficking and exploitation, of course, were great cause for concern among those migrants moving to Europe, but the number of victims who are actually formally identified as victims of trafficking remained extremely low, as shown by the study that we conducted along the Western Balkan route and that we are going to present today. So the aim of this webinar is indeed to introduce you to the main research results of the study, which has been recently published with the title Trafficking Along Migration Routes to Europe, Bridging the Gap Between Migration, Asylum and Anti-Trafficking. Both the study and this webinar have a special focus on unaccompanied separated children traveling to Europe along this route. And as mentioned before by our colleague, beside the full study, there is also a briefing paper, which is basically a shorter version with just key results and recommendations that was recently published. You can find the links to both of these documents either on the webinar page or here actually, or directly at the ICMPD webpage, icmpd.org, under the section of publications. So a few words about the study and the project where the study was conducted. The study was carried out in the framework of the EU-funded project, specifically under the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. The project title is Trafficking Along Migration Routes, Identification and Integration of Victims of Trafficking Among Vulnerable Groups and Unaccompanied Children. The project aims at supporting and enabling early identification, referral, protection and rehabilitation of trafficked people along migration routes. It is co-funded by the Austrian Federal Ministry for Europe, Integration and Foreign Affairs and is implemented by ICMPD in close partnership with the Council of the Baltic Sea State Secretariat, the Greek National Center for Social Solidarity, the Bulgarian National Commission to Combat Trafficking in Human Beings, La Strada International, and of course, THB. It is important to mention, before starting, that the TRAM project is structured mainly in 3 work packages. This research assessment that we are going to present now is actually the main result of the first work package, which had as a main objective to gather information that are needed to develop the other 2 work packages, which are Work Package 2, focusing more on capacity building of relevant stakeholders to better identify and refer trafficked people.
Hello, Enrique. I can see you're back, but we don't have sound from your end. Can you please unmute and mute yourself? Okay, let's wait for 10 more seconds, and if not, then we will proceed to the presentation by Roberto.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Maybe maybe the webcam is an issue, but I'll start it again.
Good. Yeah.
I just took a very short break. I'm back.
Thank you.
So I was saying that what we're going to present today is actually what has informed the other 2 work packages, one on capacity building of relevant stakeholders to better identify trafficked people among this migrant and refugee population along this route. It is currently being developed with the support of our colleagues from THB an e-learning model that is mainly based on research results, and once ready will be available online and disseminated through the Child Hub website. We will also be conducting in the next few months 2 national trainings in Bulgaria and Greece. And then it was also functional, the study, to inform Work Package 3, which is focusing more on integration of trafficked people in selected EU destination countries, which are Germany, Finland, and Sweden, by developing local level model strategic plans for integration of victims of trafficking, as well as designing a sort of integration roadmap, which is targeting more policy makers. Also, this work package is currently being implemented. So having said that, I would like now maybe to briefly introduce participants to the two presenters today. Maria Antonia Di Maio, who is an independent consultant with more than 15 years of experience at international level in human rights, child protection, anti-trafficking, asylum and migration issues, mainly focusing on Southeast and Western Europe. In the framework of the TRAM research assessment, she was the expert on unaccompanied separated children. You can read her full bio on the webinar page. And Roberto Forin, who is currently working as program coordinator for the Mixed Migration Center in Geneva. Before moving to Geneva, Roberto was actually part of our project team. He was the research coordinator for ICMPD, and he coordinated the research assessment that is going to present now in a few seconds. He also acted internally as a thematic expert on protection of migrants and on anti-trafficking in conflict and other humanitarian setting. Again, his full bio is available for you at the webinar webpage. Roberto, if you can hear me, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes to introduce the main research results of the study, after which I would give the floor to Antonia, who is going to focus specifically on results related to unaccompanied and separated children. Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you, Enrico, and then hello to everybody. I hope that you can hear me well, and then if you don't say otherwise, I assume that you do. So as Enrico said, I will now try to quickly present the main finding of the research assessment and of the report, the Trafficking Along Migration Route to Europe. Maybe, let me see if this function. Yeah, so the overall objective of the assessment, as Enrico already mentioned, was to enhance knowledge on THB and exploitation trend along migration route, identify gaps, challenges, and good practices in the identification, referral, protection, and rehabilitation of THB victims. All this in the context of the migration and asylum processes that were taking place back then. The period that we covered was basically from 2015 onward. By onward, we basically aim to cover until 2017 included, more or less. So in order to fulfill this overall objective, we decided to work on 3 research questions. The first is about the phenomenon of trafficking itself, and the risk of exploitation and trafficking for vulnerable migrants and migrants. The second was more specifically looking at issue related to identification and referral from the perspective of the gaps that existed in the procedures and related training needs for frontline responders. And the third research question was on protection and rehabilitation. So what are the gaps and needs and good practices in the protection and rehabilitation of identified trafficked people. In all 3 research questions, there was a specific focus on unaccompanied and separated children, which will be covered by Antonia later on. In terms of methodology and scope, we decided to conduct the study in 8 countries that we think that were a good sampling for the Western Balkan route: Greece, Bulgaria, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, now Northern Macedonia, Serbia, Austria, Germany, Sweden, and Finland. So not only the Balkan route, but also destination countries, of course. And then in terms of methodology, we try to work with a triangulation of data whereby We have been looking at literature review, official THB statistics, migration and THB policy institutional framework, but of course also the interviews that we conducted. About the interviews, we first conducted a stakeholder mapping of the many stakeholders involved in migration, asylum, and anti-trafficking. So anti-trafficking, border management, reception services, asylum services, NGO, so on and so forth. After that, since seriously?
Roberto, you can go on. We can hear you very well.
Hello?
Yes, please go on.
Yeah, because everything disappeared from my screen, but happy to know that I'm back.
Interesting. No, for us it's perfect. Go ahead.
Okay. But can you do something, because I hear back my voice now, which is quite annoying. I'll continue and I'll switch off the sound for now, because I'm participating as a participant, I guess. So I was saying that we had the stakeholder mapping, and then we, after conducting stakeholder mapping, we identify a sample amongst the many stakeholders that we identified, so as to have a good representation of all the stakeholders involved. And after that, we conducted 159 semi-structured interview for the purpose of the study, an average of 20 interviews per country. I can move the presentation forward because something has changed in my, thank you. So we have two main limitations. The most important, the fact that we didn't interview directly migrants. We did that because of lack of time, lack of funding, and in order to do that in a proper way, so we decided not to do it. We nevertheless think that the results that we collected are still important and relevant for advancing understanding of the phenomenon. SMPD is currently conducting another study where we are actually interviewing migrants. So you will be able to see soon the report coming out from that other study. And the second is specifically linked to unaccompanied and separated, whereby we just look at the aspect that related to anti-trafficking, not the whole broad range of aspects related to protection of unaccompanied and separated. Next slide. We are now moving into the research questions. As I said, the three research questions. The first, about the phenomenon of THB, how important is the phenomenon of THB along the Western Balkan route, and what are the risks of exploitation and trafficking that exist. Next slide. So the first key finding is that in general, the country covered by this assessment continue to mainly identify EU citizens who are victims of sexual and labor exploitation, and sub-Saharan African, particularly women, as trafficked persons, and therefore there is a very limited number of people who have used the Balkan route that have been officially identified as victims of trafficking human beings. So this, Rick already mentioned it, it was the reason for conducting the study, one of the reasons, and then the study confirmed that there is a very limited number of people. But of course, the most important part is to understand why. And so when it's coming to the why that happened, next slide, please. We have identified four main reasons for this low identification. First, challenges to identification due to a disconnect between asylum and migration actor and procedure on the one hand, and anti-trafficking on the other. This is actually, as the title of the study already tells you, probably the most important and sort of overarching finding, conclusion of our result, of our study. We will probably discuss that a bit later when we move to the conclusion and recommendation. The second is that in certain countries, particularly the one along the Western Balkan route, the perception by migrants and the authority alike was that the country in question was only a country of transit, and therefore it did not make sense for migrants to seek or for stakeholders to provide support services, including identification, referral, and protection. Then the third element that there is insufficient evidence available in order to determine whether a case constitutes trafficking in human being, and this linked to what we have called in the report the vicious circles of lack of statistics, whereby there is a lack of statistics indicating that trafficking in human being as a important phenomenon, which lead to a lack of attention given to the phenomenon, which lead to limited evidence gathered, and then so on and so forth, whereby the phenomenon of trafficking remains somehow not very much explored as it should. Next question, next slide. The second key finding, that in the context of the Balkan route, trafficking is often related to the smuggling process. So as migrant smuggling and human trafficking are, as we all know, distinct concepts and realities, in the context of the Balkan route, increasingly restrictive border control policy and the lack of legal alternative for onward movement basically playing into the hand of some groups and individuals who offer migrant smuggling services and use the opportunity to also perpetrate trafficking and other forms of exploitation. Next slide, please. We think that, and the studies show that this is an important phenomenon happening in along the Western Balkan route and destination country. We have basically two kind of issues that came out clearly from the report. The fact, as I said, this is mainly the result of the increasingly restrictive migration policy and border control, and the lack of legal alternative for migrants. So this lead to people, to migrants, being in debt with smugglers, because sometimes the price of the smuggling services increase because of the increased difficulties in crossing border, and then this make people particularly vulnerable to trafficking and particularly to exploitation for the labor. And then a second part is that we also see migrants themselves being sometimes involved in smuggling activities and other kind of forced criminality. Next slide. Another finding, always for the first research question, that very often trafficking and exploitation occur not in the country of destination, but rather in a country of origin or in transit. Next slide. And this has three main results. It is more difficult for the authority to officially identify cases or to investigate them. Therefore, it's more difficult to prosecute. And then overall, this, of course, is detrimental to the protection of trafficked people. Next slide. All this said, even if the number of officially identified cases are quite limited, the study managed to identify some emerging form of trafficking in the context of movement along the Western Balkan route, mostly from anecdotal sources, anecdotal information and other sources. We have three main emerging forms of trafficking and exploitation. So, sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, and forced criminality. The first, sexual exploitation, mainly affecting women and girls, but also boys and men, particularly Afghani, subject to sexual exploitation and the so-called bachabazi. And then we also have the phenomenon of survival sex, that also seems to be a prevalent phenomenon, with adult and children in a situation where they have no alternative but to exchange sex for goods or services or to engage in prostitution. It is often unclear whether cases of survival sex also constitute sexual exploitation or sex trafficking. Then we have the labor exploitation, as I said before, often lead to the fact that people are left in desperate situation when they are stranded in transit, and they become particularly vulnerable to labor exploitation. And then the third is forced criminality, particularly linked to smuggling, as I said before, whereby some migrants are forced themselves to take part of the smuggling business. Next slide, please. As I said, we also look at the risk factor that affect migrants traveling along the Balkan route. We have identified two different kind of risk factors. The risk factors that are linked to the legal and policy framework, and then the risk factors that are more linked to the individual level. So when it comes to legal and policy, we have basically asylum procedure, which are in themselves risk factors, especially when the answer is negative, but also due to the long waiting period. The legal status in itself is a risk factor. It's very complicated to obtain some sort of legal status while on the move and also at the destination country. And then this exposes people to increased vulnerability to trafficking and exploitation. Then we have the issue of restricted migration policy, which we have described already as being a crucial element in making people more vulnerable, for the reason that we explained before. And then the last, the residency in accommodation center in itself, it has proved to be sometimes a risk factor, since some of these accommodation centers were places which expose people to sexual and gender-based violence, drug use and drug dealing, and then contact with migrant smugglers. Next slide. The last key finding, we have quite a lot of finding on the first research question. As I was saying before, the risk factor that belong to the individual sphere. We have the previous experience of violence and trauma, which expose people to make people particularly vulnerable to other situations of violence and trauma. Then we had the fact of women and children traveling alone. The fact that many migrants on the move seems to be unaware of the rights. And then even if they are aware of the rights, it's difficult to access the right that they have because of the lack of knowledge of the local language and then of the country-specific knowledge. And last, that we already discussed, that with smugglers. We can now move to the research question number 2. Next slide. And I see that I have 10 minutes to go, so I'll try to speed up a little bit. So the second research question was the one looking at identification, referral, en route. Yeah. So here we have next slide. The first key finding is linked to what we said before, that the number of identified victim was very limited, and this is linked to the lack of THB indicator in the context of mixed migration flow. So only few countries covered by the assessment have developed a regularly used specific indicator in the context of migration and asylum procedure. This again somehow is linked to this connection between anti-trafficking and asylum, which I mentioned before, which is going to come up again later. Actually, it's going to come up now. The research, the next slide, please. So, which, as I said, is very central to our study, the disconnect between migration, asylum, and anti-trafficking. By migration and asylum procedure, we mean reception identification, vulnerability screening, accommodation, and asylum procedure. whereby for anti-trafficking we mean identification, referral, assistance, and protection. So as everybody understands, very often the first level interaction happen in the context of asylum and migration procedure, and then within this procedure, not very often, if ever, there is also a focus on anti-trafficking, so identification, referral, and this is a problem because on the one hand, this would be a great opportunity because all migrants sooner or later, or the vast majority, have interaction with authority in the context of migration management or asylum, and therefore would be a great opportunity to include in that a focus on anti-trafficking. But unfortunately, the reality is that this seems to happen very rarely. Why so? Next slide. It's so because of, first of all, obviously, lack of time and resources. On this, you have to remember that the study was covering the period of the almost 1 million people transiting through the route in very limited time. And so it's no surprise that first responder was just overwhelmed by the numbers. And in that, the priority was often given to first reception, provision of basic services, and then later on to asylum procedure. The side effect of the reality of huge flows. Also, the study highlighted that the introduction of fast-track procedure, such as safe country of origin concept or the very hotspot approach, aiming at expediting asylum procedure, very often led to even less time to be given to the possibility of conduct identification and referral. Then we have the limited exchange of info between different authorities, particularly law enforcement, migration, asylum, and anti-trafficking. And lack of centralized standard operating procedure for identification and referral, particularly when identification and referral has to be carried out not by anti-trafficking, but rather by other actors. Unfortunately, there are no clear procedures. Next slide, please. So the third finding, we've been for now speaking mostly about the problem that exists for migrants that are somehow part of, or they fall into the migration management system and they are in accommodation facility. The study highlighted that when migrants sooner or later happen to fall out for choice or for not for their choice of the reception system, they become even more invisible. And then there is extremely complicated for migrants to be identified. This is particularly the case of the stranded migrants. Stranded migrants defined as those that they find themselves stranded in a country that is not the country destination. Since these migrants, they tend themselves to stay as far as possible from authority, because they are afraid that if they are identified in a country that is not the country destination, they will be forced to remain there. So for those people, vulnerability to trafficking exploitation is definitely a problem, and identification is a challenge. Key finding number 4, next slide. As we did for the research question first, one on the phenomenon, we look at the phenomenon, then we look at the risk factor. In identification and referral, we look at the gaps, and then we look at the barriers that somehow exist for the potential victim or actual victim to be identified. So we have two categories: barriers to identification at individual level and at systemic level. So we have three at the individual level. The first is fear and mistrust of the authority among people vulnerable to trafficking or presumed victim, something that I was mentioning in my previous slide as well. The lack of awareness of protection rehabilitation services available to trafficking victims, also something that we have already mentioned. And then in the context of migration flow to the Western Balkan route, we find out that also men are often very vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation, but somehow remain a blind spot in the identification referral procedure, which tend to focus when they focus on something on women and children mostly. Next slide are the barriers to identification at systemic level. So something that we also mentioned before, the transit country paradigm, as we call it, from the perspective of the migrants, whereby migrants prefer not to be identified as THB victim in a country which is not their intended country of destination. The criminalization of victims of trafficking, particularly in the context of labor exploitation, whereby migrants who are caught to work illegally, they are sometimes criminalized instead of being considered as victims. And then the third is the priority given to security and combating migrant smuggling, as opposed to identify potential victims amongst migrants, so putting the rights and the protection of the migrant at the center. Next slide. The last finding for the research question number 2, training needs that we have been identifying. So first of all, as we said, THB training for frontline responder, including police officer. We keep saying the same, right? That unfortunately frontline responders and very often law enforcement were the first encounter for migrants seems to be lacking very often very basic knowledge of identification referral procedure. And then a sort of second layer is the training that is needed for asylum services staff, who very often also seem to be lacking this. Now we can move to the last research question for the last few minutes of this presentation. The first research question was about the gaps, needs, and good practices in the protection and rehabilitation of trafficked people. We can move. Next slide. So here it's important to make a small introduction, which should not come as a surprise by now, because we've been repeating over and over that the number of identified victims of trafficking along the Western Balkan route remain very limited. And therefore, the study was able to gather very limited findings in the area of protection and rehabilitation of THB victims, because for protection and rehabilitation system for victims of trafficking to be tested, you need to have a significant number of presumed victims, which was not the case, unfortunately. Next slide. Instead, we were able to gather a number of findings also in this area, the area of protection and rehabilitation. In terms of gaps, we saw we were able to identify a number of gaps in the provision of short and long-term protection and assistance services to identify victims. So the first is linked to the lack of appropriate accommodation option in a protected environment, particularly for young men. Something that we have mentioned before. This has led to accommodation facility often becoming places which increase the risk of the vulnerability to trafficking and exploitation rather than provide appropriate services. The second is the lack of staff and funding needed for appropriate long-term protection and assistance services. So not only lack of staff for identification referral, but also lack of staff and funding for the protection rehabilitation services. And then we have identified gaps in the existing legal framework and lack of coordination mechanism. Lack of legal framework, we mean lack of protective legal framework aiming at quickly give formal identification for potential victim of trafficking, so as to be able to start immediately the provision of long-term protection and assistance services. And lack of coordination mechanism between different service providers is also something that came out from our study. And next slide, the research question. Next slide, yeah. The second main finding when it comes to protection and rehabilitation, and somehow the more striking one, or the one that came out a bit strongly, is that resident status is contingent upon participation in criminal procedure. And then, as we all know, obtaining a legal status is crucial for people traveling along the Balkan route. And unfortunately, too often, in the framework of the protection rehabilitation services for identified victims of trafficking, the legal status of trafficking victim is uncertain and is linked to their cooperation in criminal proceeding. And this discourages presumed victim from seeking redress and hamper proper long-term rehabilitation for victims of trafficking. So with this, we are done with the finding along the three research questions. There is a last slide on the recommendation. I think that is important. You will be able to read the recommendation in the report. I don't want to go too far because I still would like you to have a look at the report himself or at the briefing paper, which is a quite digestible document of 25 pages. So I'm not going through all recommendation, but I think that, as I said before, it's important to stress yet another time that the main point, the main issue identified by our study and our report is the strong need to reconcile asylum, migration, and anti-trafficking procedure for the two main reasons, as I said before. On the one hand, migration, so border management, and asylum represent a great opportunity for conducting first-level identification, since most of the migrants have an interaction with law enforcement or asylum officer during their journey, and being in transit country or destination country, and will be extremely important to be absolutely sure that when they do that, more attention is given to first-level identification and referral to proper or to more specialized anti-trafficking actor for continuing the next step in the procedure, which is basically formal identification, protection, and then rehabilitation. So I think I will conclude here. Next slide. Thank you for your attention. As Enrico said, in the meantime, I moved to another organization, but I leave my details here in case you want to reach for some question, comment. But when it comes to the study, when it comes to SMPD, who conducted the study, the focal point remain Enrico, who you met before, Senior Protection Manager. Thank you very much, and then I leave the floor to Enrico and Antonio.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for this very comprehensive presentation. Maybe before taking questions, I would go directly to Antonia, who will, hi Antonia, who will provide us with some more information about specific results related to unaccompanied separated children. Please.
Thank you, Enrico. Good afternoon, everybody. The previous speaker, Roberto, has already outlined the three key research questions that have indeed led the trauma assessment that we are presenting today. I will now go back to each of those three questions, and I will try to bring the focus on unaccompanied and separated children according to the research design. So in particular, I will look at some of the key findings across the three areas that Roberto has already outlined: risks of exploitation and trafficking, gaps and training needs among frontline responders concerning identification and referral, and gaps and needs in the production of trafficked persons when it comes to unaccompanied and separated children. Okay, let's start with the research question number one. As a general consideration, we found that while children, particularly unaccompanied and separated children, but also to some extent older adolescents and young persons, seem to largely share the risk factors for trafficking and exploitation identified in relation to adults, some factors appear to be specific to children, in that these factors either expose apparently only them to the risk of trafficking and exploitation, or expose them to an increased risk compared to adults. So children traveling completely alone, Roberto has already mentioned it, they have been widely recognized not only in the framework of the TRAM but also in previous literature as one of the most at-risk groups of migrants and refugees. Across the countries reviewed, it emerged that some children started their journey as completely as unaccompanied or separated, while other children were separated during their travel, including upon identification by authorities. And at times, children were even separated from their parents, who were incriminated and detained for illegal border crossing. And unless, as you know, unless they were very young, these children were not allowed to follow their parents and were held separately. However, the study also exposed that also children traveling in groups could face risks as they might be subject to exploitation by adult members of the group as a form of compensation for having been allowed to join the group and the travel. Risks related to the legal status and legal procedures. The study identified several specific to children. As you've heard, I mean, the research revealed that when asylum seekers receive a negative decision, they become particularly vulnerable to trafficking as well as other forms of violence and abuse. And the research also highlighted that this vulnerability affects, to an even increased extent, young people whose application was rejected after they turned 18. So they share the same condition as adult asylum seekers, with the increased vulnerability of being very young and still in need of support. According to the report, some unaccompanied and separated children turned 18 while instead their status determination procedure was still pending, and faced with the obligation to move to reception center for adults, they prefer to move to informal accommodation settling, thus losing contact with the authorities and most service providers, a fact which obviously exposes them to a heightened risk of trafficking and exploitation, and also other forms of violence and abuse. Concerning legal procedures, again, one risk factor that is specific to unaccompanied and separated children, highlighted in the framework of the study, is represented by the delays in appointment of a guardian and or by the guardian's very limited or insufficient capacity to appropriately care for each individual child that they are responsible for. This was basically across many countries, and besides being a well-known gap in the protection of these children in general, this circumstance appears to also aggravate the risk for these children to be exposed to trafficking and exploitation. Coming to risks related to accommodation and care, findings across the countries reviewed by the study revealed that many unaccompanied and separated children do not enjoy adequate care and placement, and this will be no surprise to the participants who have joined us today. And this was allegedly due to several factors. In most countries, these children risk to have been wrongly identified and treated as adults due to faulty age assessment procedures. and in particular they risk to be accommodated with unrelated adults. Now we could talk about age assessment for hours, but we know that in brief this is the main, in many cases, the main entry point for accessing or conversely for being excluded from a wide, the whole range of fundamental rights that children should enjoy, and particular children deprived of parental care. While wrong procedures are of course detrimental for children in general, they also expose them to trafficking and exploitation according to the study. Now, even those children who were identified as children, so as under 18, they were placed at times in facilities that are not suitable for them, in many cases due to the shortage of places in unaccompanied and separated children's specific shelters and centers. In addition to that, so to being accommodated for different reasons with unrelated adults, unaccompanied and separated children are also at times placed in detention for migration-related reasons. And again, in a detention center, without countering the fundamental rights of children, detention can also expose children to an increased risk of abuse and exploitation. Finally, in virtually all countries assessed as part of this study, a considerable number of children were reported as having left care. And being outside the child protection system, of course, exposes them to a range of risks, including trafficking and exploitation. All the stakeholders recognize that despite the fact that what happens to these children is not really known, they are anyway particularly vulnerable and at risk. Now, I will move quickly to the research question number 2. Again, as a general consideration, according to the assessment, most of the gaps and barriers to identification as presumed or actual victims of trafficking that apply to adults, as well as of training need for professionals, relate also to unaccompanied and separated children. But in addition, some gaps, barriers, and training needs appear to be more specific to children. Unaccompanied and separated children who are outside the asylum, migration, and child protection system. Well, it was, again, I already mentioned that a considerable number of these children were reported as having left and therefore being outside of care. While this is a risk factor, it was also believed to be as a barrier to the actual identification of trafficking cases among them, because of course it becomes increasingly and extremely difficult to do that. Barriers in identifying children as such, although to a limited extent due to the specific focus on trafficking, a range of obstacles to the identification of unaccompanied and separated children in general was pointed to across the countries reviewed. And it was highlighted that wrong identification of children as adults or as not separated or unaccompanied also contributes to hindering identification of potential trafficking cases among them. Then finally, training needs. We had a variety of findings here. In some countries, the research highlighted the lack of sufficient police units and agents specialized in dealing with child victims of trafficking. In other cases, stakeholders pointed to limited awareness among relevant professionals about the specific forms of trafficking and exploitation that unaccompanied and separated children might be particularly exposed or subjected to. They were referring in particular to child backing and to cases of forced marriage when it relates to trafficking, and that hamper to correct identification of exploitation and trafficking among them. Limited awareness of more subtle means to control child victims that traffickers might resort to, in particular in terms of psychological pressure, was also exposed as a factor limiting the identification of cases of child trafficking. And in some countries, actually, stakeholders were concerned that even the very offense of child trafficking and its constituting elements, in particular the fact that coercive or deceiving means of recruitment are not required for the child to be a victim of trafficking as long as the acts and exploitative aim are in place. So in some countries, as I said, stakeholders were afraid that even those elements might not be entirely clear to professionals who are in the position to identify trafficked children along the route. Additional challenges related finally to the lack of awareness and/or of capacity among specific groups of professionals, particularly within the child protection system, regarding the identification of trafficking cases among unaccompanied and separated children. In some countries, stakeholders expressed that the view that guardians, child welfare authorities, social workers, and also nurses are among the professionals whose awareness concerning child trafficking in particular should be somehow increased. I will now move to the third area and research question, which concerns gaps, needs, and good practices in the protection and rehabilitation of trafficked people. Well, now in terms of child-specific findings, some stakeholders explicitly stress that providing proper assistance and protection to presumed and actual victims of trafficking among children, as well as young persons, proved to be particularly difficult in terms of engaging with them, providing viable alternatives to the exploitative situation that they might be in, and so on. But as Roberto highlighted, due to the broad thematic scope of the study on the one hand, so the number of issues that we looked at, and on the other hand, on the specific focus on trafficking, the research did not look into the whole range of protection measures and gaps therein, including care and placement, appointment of a guardian, best interest determination and assessment, and subsequent return, resettlement, or integration pathways available to unaccompanied and separated children in general. But several gaps therefore emerged in the provision of short and long-term protection and assistance with a focus on children who might be victims of trafficking. So lack of appropriate care and placement was highlighted as one of these. Lack of appropriate accommodation options as a challenge for child victims of trafficking in terms of no or very few safe reception facilities for victims of trafficking who are children, because besides a few specialized facilities that are maybe mostly in place for girls, most child victims are placed apparently in large-scale reception centers, which generally are not regarded as suitable to effectively provide assistance and protection to these children. In a number of countries reviewed, and again, as everybody in the room I'm sure knows, the lack of appropriate care and placement options for unaccompanied and separated children, or the lack of sufficient places in existing dedicated reception facilities was strongly highlighted as a broader structural challenge that, of course, hinders the protection of these children as a broader group, but also of potential and actual cases of trafficking among them. Again, children, the fact that unaccompanied and separated children leave care within a short period of time, even sometimes a few days or weeks after placement, was referred to by some stakeholders as a major barrier, not only constituting a risk, hindering identification, but also, of course, limiting or preventing the protection of these children also in the context of trafficking. Regarding the lack of appropriate long-term protection and assistance services, difficulties in accessing services were referred to in some countries, specifically in relation to child victims of trafficking. So some interviewees highlighted that the level of services provided at local level by different municipalities differs, largely depending on the availability of resources. Others in other countries spoke about the lack of specialized protection services for child victims of trafficking as a key challenge. And in some cases, allegedly some groups of unaccompanied and separated children, namely adolescents, experienced apparently discrimination in enjoying the services that are otherwise available to the other children in the situation. Another aspect related to services is the inadequacy of the education system that was pointed to in several countries reviewed. So the inadequacy to integrate and retain these children, generally, but also including potential victims of trafficking, by offering an enticing alternative and by also providing a holding and supporting environment around them, was mentioned as a protection challenge. gaps and challenges related to the legal framework and coordination mechanisms. I mean, the lack of timely referral of unaccompanied and separated children to child protection institutions and services was also highlighted, of course, in some countries. And as already mentioned earlier, issues concerning the effective functioning of the guardianship system for unaccompanied and separated children. Fear of contact with authorities, the difficulties in gaining trust of the potential or actual victims that was, I think, prominent across the research findings, also was highlighted in relation to children. Some stakeholders in particular reported that some children appeared to them uninterested in escaping the exploitation that they are subjected to, and that they didn't perceive their situation would improve if they remained at the shelter where they were placed. These children often, according to some stakeholders, did not really know that they were victims of trafficking. They did not perceive themselves as victims. And again, language barriers, lack of sufficient number of interpreters, but also of staff who was able to engage and communicate properly with children according to the age and maturity, was also highlighted as hampering communication between the child and the service providing professionals, and therefore limiting the protection that could be provided to them. This is basically all that I wanted to highlight concerning the main research findings related to unaccompanied and separated children. You will find further and more detailed information in the report. Now, I would like to thank everybody for your attention, and I will now mute myself, switch off the camera, but still I will be available and happy to answer any questions or requests of clarifications that you might have. So thanks everybody, and I hope I stick to my time limit.
Thank you very much, Antonia. I've been collecting a few questions here on the chat, for which I will revert mainly to Roberto, I guess. So the first one has to do with the methodology. So how were data gathered, and who did the researchers talk to? What about the confidentiality and ethical issues? Maybe if either Roberto or Antonia, I would say more Roberto, is also very conveniently there on the screen, the question. Please. We cannot hear you, Roberto. Can you unmute your mic?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Now you should be able to hear me. So when it comes to the data gathering methods, as I said before, to sample the respondents, what we did was a very broad stakeholder mapping, where we identify a large number of stakeholders in the frame of, as I said before, anti-trafficking, migration management, border control, asylum services, but also accommodation services, and amongst those, state authority, NGO were identified. Once we had the stakeholder mapping, what we did was to identify a representative sample purposely, so that we try to be sure that we have representation from each and every of the sector that we want to target. So mostly anti-trafficking, asylum, border management, and protection, if you like. After that, we have used a semi-structured questionnaire or guidelines more, that we use to gather the information from the identified respondent. In terms of confidentiality, what we did, we asked consent, of course, to each respondent to use the data, and then we asked them if they want to remain anonymous, and then if they don't want to remain anonymous, to which extent or how we could quote them. And then for those who ask, we also send back the quote that we use in the report. That was basically it. When it comes to ethical issue, we had limited problem with that since we haven't interviewed migrants themselves, as I said at the beginning. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Roberto.
Answer to your question, Rod. You must be working for the European Union.
The other question I found in order here is more related to training needs and gaps, if I well understand. So what kind of training for frontline officers do you see as crucial? Well, maybe before going into research results, maybe it's important to say now that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are developing together with Third Zone an e-learning model, and Antonia Di Maio is again involved as the main person behind the content of the training curriculum, which will be online, so is also it's not the classical training curriculum. But what we can tell you right now is that we have set a few objectives for this e-learning course, and these we wish that participants at the end of this course are able to list and describe different types of human trafficking, recognize factors that put people at risk of trafficking, explain reasons why frontline workers often have challenges in the identification process, identify potential victims of trafficking based on common indicators, and effectively communicate with potential victims, and being able to refer potential victims to a service provider in appropriate manner. So we decided with the partnership to focus on these learning objectives. And I don't know if Roberto would like to say more about the training gaps that were identified.
Yeah, I think Enrico was disconnected. But yes,
I'm back.
Yeah, welcome back, Enrico. We keep taking this small break.
Yeah.
I think that, I mean, first of all, it's very interesting that this question comes from someone from Sweden, and I will tell you later why. I think that what we had in mind after having completed the study is that it would be a kind of basic training needed on anti-trafficking, because as I said before, the reality is that many of the law enforcement and asylum staff, they have interaction with migrants. And in theory, all what is needed is to be able to recognize simple element that could lead to, that could indicate that indeed we are maybe facing a potential victim of trafficking. And then when that happened, to be able to quickly refer the person to, let's say, proper anti-trafficking specialist. And this, unfortunately, is we have seen as is not happening in most of the country along the Western Balkan route. On the other hand, and now this brings me to Sweden and Finland, we also have seen in the study how when this is actually done, it has a major impact. So in Sweden, the Swedish Migration Agency, who is in charge of first reception and asylum procedure, has indeed started basically including anti-trafficking in the initial procedure, first reception procedure, and later on the asylum. And this has resulted in a dramatic increase of identified victim of trafficking. If I remember well, we are speaking of a 5-time increase of identified victim. And then also something similar had happened in Finland. In Finland, it has happened because the asylum services is also the national referral mechanism for protection of trafficked people. And so, let's say this gap that we have mentioned between asylum and anti-trafficking has been bridged, indeed, and this also there has resulted in a very high number of potential victims of trafficking identified. So to summarize, what is needed is a very basic training, and training alone is not enough. What is needed is really to establish standard operating procedure for linking the three different processes: border management, asylum, and anti-trafficking.
Thank you, Roberto. I keep disconnecting, so I'm not putting the camera anymore. There is another question more related to Finland in this case. I think you can also read it there. It's about identification of trafficking victims in Finland. How does it come? It was the only country where a significant number of victims coming from the Balkan route was identified. Were there previous training for frontline officers and best practices that we can learn from? Roberto? Your microphone, Roberto, please.
Sorry, can you quickly repeat the question?
You can read it on the notes.
Pay attention. Yeah, it's more or less what I just said, right? In Finland, what has happened is that this bridge that exists in other countries between first reception, asylum procedure, and anti-trafficking has been breached, and then this has resulted in a significant increase of identification. And then we definitely have a lesson learned there. By the way, what we identify as sort of lesson learned or interesting practice, they are mentioned in the report in some small boxes that are called in focus. And then all these practices that we identify as being important and then positive, I'm sure that they will be used, as Enrico said before, for the finalization of the e-learning tool on identification referral that Antonia and THB colleagues are preparing, so as to, how to say, to tap on what has been done already in terms of good practices and try to replicate them elsewhere.
Okay, I think we can take the last, I can see there are three questions. Two are more related to clarifications related to what Roberto said, and one is more specific on the protection of unaccompanied separated children when traveling cross-border. Maybe we start with Antonia with this question, which is a general question about how the study itself, the results of the study can be used to enforce on a national, to be used to enforcement on a national level. Well, the study results will be disseminated. It was just published, and as I said, there will be this e-learning model which is building on these results, which is targeting specifically frontline officers. At the same time, there will be two national trainings in the two most relevant entry points, which are for this route, which are Greece and Bulgaria. And there are specific recommendations related to unaccompanied separated children or to children in general, which have to do with the prompt appointment of a guardian. But maybe I can let Antonia elaborate on this. And then, Roberto, if you can please address these two clarifications related to lack of appropriate care and other forms of trafficking. Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yes, good. So, well, indeed, yeah, there is a number of recommendations in the study specific to children that you can read, but as Roberto said, I don't want to completely spoil your pleasure of reading the study. You know, I'm jokingly saying this, but what I want you to focus on is that, I mean, one sure way that I think the study can contribute to helping actors at the national level, frontline professionals, is hopefully will be achieved through training, but generally through a broader awareness of the specific features, somehow different ones, the trafficking, exploitation, and I would say also the other crimes that the migrants and refugees are subjected to, are taking place along the so-called Eastern Mediterranean and Western Balkan route. And I think sometimes the stakeholders are confronted with situations where they do see extreme forms of violence like kidnapping, severe beatings, rape, that they simply don't know how to react and how to refer these individuals to assistance and protection that they need. Now, in terms of cross-border cooperation, if I got right to the question, the second part of the question, I can say that generally, not necessarily in the framework of this study, but THB, whom I work with as consultant for this study, has been recommending the establishment of a case management system that would enable all the concerned actors to detect and identify children on the move, all of them, not only limited to the cases of child victims of trafficking, and to assess their individual situations and provide support in a coordinated fashion. Of course, elements should be embedded and support this transnational cooperation, and these affect the establishment of effective channels for communication and information exchange among countries of origin, transit, and destination, particularly when it comes to family investigation procedures and service provision, but also establishing clear referral procedures among countries to be applied to all children, and then some specific provisions for some groups, typically child victims of trafficking, and ensuring, of course, lasting political and financial support to the cooperation, because otherwise any established contacts and procedures fade, as well as a monitoring system to ensure oversight and accountability to the system of case management at transnational level. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Antonia. So the last couple of clarifications, Roberto, do you feel you can also answer the question about lack of appropriate care, or would you rather leave it to Antonia?
But I mean, I think that the lack of appropriate care is quite relevant for the specific issue of unaccompanied and separated. So maybe Antonia want to answer, but in general, what it can be said is, as I said before, there are two kind of level. I don't know to which part of the report the participant is referring to, but we have two problems there. One is sometimes in some accommodation facility, unfortunately, Greece are quite infamous. Greek hotspots became quite infamous for that. They became places where, instead of protecting people, ended up exposing them to risk of trafficking, exploitation, amongst many other protection concerns. So this is a first level of lack of appropriate care. And then the second aspect linked to the accommodation facility, which I said before in the frame of protection and rehabilitation, we know that for a victim of trafficking, particularly when these victims of trafficking are coming from foreign country, there is a need for specific services. If anything else, services provided in the language they speak. And then we have noticed in the report how this is basically missing in many countries, where services that are provided to victims of trafficking are mostly conceived for services provided to national victims, and therefore incapable of responding to the specific need of migrant victims. I hope I have I have answered the question. Maybe do you want to add something, Antonia, from the specific perspective of
Sure.
unaccompanied
If
separated?
I well understand the question, well, you know that unaccompanied and separated children must be found suitable care placements as soon as possible after arrival or identification. We all know that, and we of course used the broader concept of care arrangements and not only accommodation, as this best indicates the response that the different physical and psychological, as well as safety and development and other needs of these children. Now, lack of appropriate care and placement options namely refer to the fact that sometimes this problem in some countries was allegedly due to the limited capacity, so lack of available child care facilities. In other cases, very complex administrative procedures and requirements for the placement of these children in existing facilities was there, and or lack of clarity concerning the roles and the mandates of the different institutions in charge. And also sometimes, again, according to the research results, resistance from managers of the existing reception facilities. And these were all mentioned as obstacles for these children to finding appropriate care and accommodation, or care and placement upon identification, upon arrival and identification.
Thank you, Antonia. I think we said we're going to take these two last questions now. Roberto, concerning forms of trafficking, including child labor, there is a request to further elaborate on these. Maybe you can mention about the exploitation in petty crimes or drug dealing, and in the same smuggling of migrants.
Yeah, you just did it, so I no need to. Yeah, no. When it comes to child exploitation, I think that most of the information that we collected during the study were referring to exploitation taking place in Turkey, in particular. And then these were mostly pointing at exploitation in criminal activity, actually not exactly labor exploitation, particularly children forced to become involved in drug smuggling and selling drugs, and children forced to provide smuggling services and assist smugglers in a different way, including to look for a client amongst migrants. So that's basically it.
Okay, thank you. Very last question is related to the connection, I guess, of these research results to child protection minimum standards, which are currently under revision. Antonia?
Yes, very, very simply, as Roberto already mentioned, and also myself, the study wasn't really supposed to undertake an in-depth and systematic assessment of the protection, of how the existing different sets of protection standards, including this one, and standards for good practice in dealing with unaccompanied and separated children were applied in those countries. We simply couldn't achieve to do that due to the number of reasons related to focus and constraints. But we hope that we did tackle upon some of the most problematic gaps and issues that would affect specifically child victims of trafficking among the broader group of unaccompanied and separated children, and the broader group of children on the move, and if you want, also of children, young people and adolescents on the move.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have addressed all your questions. As I just typed in the chat, there will be a second webinar in the framework of the Trump project that will be held sometimes between end of September and beginning of October. We will keep you posted on that after the summer break, and we will let you know what will be the focus of this second webinar. I think at this point, well, special thanks to Claire Healy, who has been answering to some of the questions also live during the presentation. Claire, as I said in the chat, is also the co-author of this study. I think I would like now to give the floor back to our colleagues from Third Zone. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Thank you very much. Wonderful presentation, a lot of questions, direct participation. We are very happy to see that. A few things you can see now on your screen, a few polls asking how you like the webinar. Can you please take a second and answer them? In case you would like to receive a certificate confirming your participation in the webinar, please email us. You will see now the email address in the chat box. And also for future webinars, to see what's upcoming, visit childhub.org. I will put the website here. The future webinars and also one more webinar on this project will be announced there, so all information will be available. The recording of this webinar will be available soon. If you register for the webinar, you will receive an email with it. If not, on the webinar page on the website, childhub.org, you will be able to find it. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and have a nice evening. Goodbye.